bad. So it'll be interesting to find out. I've done everything I can at this point. Having said all that though, I do feel like the testing included still paints a very interesting picture. When it comes to productivity and content creation, the Ryzen 7 CPUs are extremely impressive. The Premiere Pro and Excel performance was incredible, and it really got me hyped up for the gaming performance. Unfortunately, while certainly not bad, the gaming performance was somewhat of a letdown. We always knew that this was one area where Ryzen might struggle against the Empire, so results, while a little disappointing, aren't entirely surprising. For the most part, AMD had only shown off Ryzen's gaming capabilities at the 4K resolution using a Pascal Titan X, and we all know this isn't how you test CPU gaming performance. This merely imposes a GPU bottleneck that virtually eliminates any impact the CPU might have on performance, within reason anyway. One thing I did notice is that all the games I have looked at so far, which is considerably more than the 4 shown in this video, were all incredibly smooth on the Ryzen processors. GTA 5, for example, plays very well on the Core i7-7700K, but every now and then a slight stutter can be noticed. The 1800X in comparison was as smooth as silk, and not once did I spot any kind of stuttering. I found a similar situation when testing Battlefield 1 as well. Performance was incredibly smooth with the Ryzen processors, while every now and then the quad-core 7700K had a small hiccup, though admittedly, this didn't happen often, but it's still every now and then you noticed a quick little stutter, and this was something that I never ever saw when playing for quite some time on the 1800X and 1700X. Still, as smooth as the experience was using a Ryzen 7 processor for gaming, I feel that those running high refresh rate monitors are probably still going to be best served by something like a high-clocked Core i7-6700K or 7700K. I imagine many of you are looking at the gaming performance shown here and a bit disappointed with the results. They might not be as strong as we had hoped, but they are highly competitive, and it should see the Ryzen 5 and 3 series deliver extremely competitive gaming performance. Also worth noting is that we are testing extreme gaming performance here with the Titan XP at 1080p. Ryzen does look more competitive at 1440p, and will certainly appear far more competitive as something like a GTX 1070 or Fury X handling the rendering work, so keep that in mind. Also worth keeping in mind is that although the extra cores aren't particularly useful in today's games, they could be very useful in the future. How far into the future though, I don't really know. My crystal ball is currently down for maintenance. The only other letdown was the overclocking, but again, like the gaming performance, this was something we weren't expecting Ryzen to deliver. I was only able to hit 4.1 GHz with my 1800X, and even that took quite a bit of trial and error. Sadly, the 1700X couldn't even reach 4 GHz. Still, the gains for the 1700X were decent, and at 20% more affordable, this is the processor I would buy. That said, I have no idea how well the vanilla 1700 overclocks, but I will be getting one next week. I am aware that some reviewers got them for today's release, so chances are you can already find out how well these chips clock. Power consumption was a bit higher than expected. Our Excel figures are similar to those when using a power bug program like Prime 95 for example. When gaming, Ryzen should be more efficient, and I'll look into this in another video shortly. At the end of the day, when you consider what AMD was coming from, and look at what they have achieved with Ryzen, it's nothing short of amazing. I'm personally very excited to see AMD delivering a competitive high-end CPU, and it shall be very interesting to see how well they can refine the Zen architecture over the coming years. We know that Intel has hit somewhat of a development wall, if you will, so this may afford AMD the chance to catch up even further. Of course, the good news for consumers in all this being that with the added competition, Intel has already started to adjust their pricing across the board, and I expect to see more of this as AMD turns up the heat further with their 6-core and 4-core Ryzen CPUs. For now, I do have a heap more testing to do, and I'll be aiming to deliver those results in a video early next week, assuming there's nothing seriously wrong with my test setup. I now have a few new BIOSes for the boards that I have in hand, so I'm going to apply those straight after I edit this video, and start checking out if that helps with the Cinebench single thread score. I'm really hoping it does. Hopefully after a bit more testing I can give you guys my picks and more of a concrete opinion on Ryzen. With that, I'm going to get back to the benchmark grind. I'm your host Steve, and hopefully I'll catch you next week for more Ryzen action, and I might even check out the GTX 1080 Ti while I'm at it. See you guys.
Attention, class. What's up guys, welcome back. So as your YouTube subscription feed will undoubtedly indicate, AMD's high-end line of 8-core, 16-thread Ryzen 7 chips have just hit the market, comprised of 3 SKUs based on the same architecture. From lowest to highest, they include the R7 1600, 1700X, and the 1800X. At their press event last month in San Francisco, AMD revealed an aggressive pricing scheme and touted some impressive data against the competition. Bear in mind, of course, to always take manufacturer benchmarks with a tiny grain of salt. While I won't be able to give an analysis of the R7 lineup in its entirety today, AMD did send me home with their flagship R7 1800X, a response to Intel's Core i7 6900K for about half the MSRP at just $500 US. The price point will be easily confirmed by trusted online retailers, so that leaves the proof of performance on the shoulders of the reviewers to see if the 1800X is the disruptive animal AMD claims it to be. That said, there's still much to discuss about Team Red's newcomer before it steps into the octagon with its heavyweight rival. To reiterate some of the vital specs, the 1800X packs a lower 95-watt TDP than the 6900K, with a base clock of 3.6 GHz and an auto-boosting technology that functions similarly to Intel's Turbo Boost. In multi-threaded workloads, the Ryzen chip will boost all cores to 3.7 GHz. A boost to 4 GHz is possible, but this only applies to a single core during a single-threaded task. During my single-core runs in Cinebench R15, hardware monitors showed 1 and sometimes 2 of the cores boosting to 4.1 GHz, while the others remained at their idle-state frequencies. This extra 100 MHz is courtesy of AMD's Extended Frequency Range, or XFR technology, which bumps the core to 4.1 GHz if cooling conditions allow. As far as I know, AMD hasn't confirmed exactly how this is defined, but clearly my Noctua air cooler and ambient temperature of 24°C helped XFR reach its threshold. Since all but one of today's tests utilize multiple cores, however, XFR and the single core boost feature won't have much of a positive impact on performance, so I decided to overclock all cores on both CPUs for today's benchmarks. At AMD's press event, the rep hosting their overclocking demo recommended enthusiasts not push past the 1800X's stock V-core of 1.35 volts, so staying at the base voltage, I was able to achieve just 3.9 GHz before reaching any instability. Suffice to say, if you were hoping for overclocks well beyond the 4 GHz mark, you'll be sorely disappointed unless you keep a tank of LN2 hand. Rep did mention that the Silicon Lottery will pay out the occasional 4 or 4.1 GHz part, with 4.2 GHz capable chips being more of a Powerball jackpot. Now, given Ryzen's low TDP compared to its Intel counterparts, I was excited to test thermals today, but for starters, the chip is still too fresh to be fully recognized in the usual suite of monitoring apps, and even if they were, I've been informed by the ever-so-perspicacious Steve of Gamers Nexus that Ryzen temps may not be represented properly via the software due to AMD using similarly faulty temperature diodes as their older FX chips. To no one's surprise, Gamers Nexus has the proper equipment to sidestep this issue, so in the description I've linked their Ryzen video for those interested to learn more. Now you probe that shit, don't you, Steve? You probe it good. Now we're just about ready to go gloves off with these two, but first a quick look at the separate test beds we'll be using. You'll notice our 6900K has been overclocked to 4.3 GHz, and we're using the same memory capacity and frequency, albeit a quad-core channel kit, for X99. The Noctua cooler on our 1800X was a special AMD edition that only included an AM4 bracket, so for the i7 I employed the most similarly spec'd air cooler I had on hand, this Cooler Master Hyper 212 EVO. Both systems are running the GTX 1080 Founders Edition with the latest 378.66 NVIDIA driver, and all games were tested at 1920 by 1080, 2560 by 1440, and 3840 by 2160, aka 4K. Without dragging this out any longer, folks, it's finally time to see how these two CPUs stack up and who will go home with all the glory. Then I guess they would split the glory? It doesn't matter. Ladies and gentlemen, here are the benchmarks. Alright, so as the data shows, the 1800X is by far and away the fastest processor from AMD that we have seen in years. With the current pricing at the time of publication of this video, it's an easy pick over the 6900K for video editors on a quote-unquote budget, as it delivers some quick encoding times that would likely be unmatched by a quad-core i7. Intel's 6-core 6800K may still be in the running, however. In-game, our two contenders saw a handful of stalemates, but if you look closely, this was a repeatable trend at the higher resolutions of 1440p and 4K, indicating a GPU bottleneck. At 1080p, when the test becomes CPU-bound, the 1800X falls behind every time, suffering the most in Doom, apart from having favorable 0.1% lows, and Metro Last Light with concerning 0.1% lows and 8.5% slower average frame rates. Now, it's been established that the 7700K's higher IPC often makes it the better gaming chip over the 6900K, so this positions the 1800X as a less compelling option for die-hard gamers, especially at a 43% price hike over flagship Kaby Lake. One area where 8-core Ryzen appears suited for gaming is when live encoding is thrown into the mix. Playing Doom on Ultra Quad HD while streaming out to 1080-60 scaled all 16 of our logical cores, and kept up with the 6900K by delivering fluid gameplay and zero dropped frames. In this regard, the 1800X makes a case for hardcore streamers who might value the encoding capabilities over raw FPS, particularly if they'll also be cutting up highlight reels with the software. Additionally, users interested in purely gaming should continue looking to the i5 and i7 Kaby Lake options for now. From a gamer's perspective, AMD may have lost this first battle, but the war is far from over, as we anxiously wait to see if upcoming Ryzen parts will offer higher instructions per clock to better compete with Kaby Lake. That's all I got for now, guys, so let me know in the comments what you think of Ryzen so far and how it's measured up to your expectations. Before you guys go, don't forget to toss me a like on this video if you enjoyed it. You can also check out my store and get $5 off if you buy one of each of my two new shirt designs, Evolution and Crystal RGB, because together we can light up some crystal. As always, I am Kyle with Bitwit. Thank you guys so much for watching. Subscribe to the channel if you haven't already, and I will see y'all in the next video.
Hey everybody, welcome to PC Perspective. I'm Ryan Shrout, here today with probably one of the most anticipated reviews and launches that I can remember in 17 years of doing this. And that actually says quite a lot. We're here to talk about the AMD Ryzen processor, the consumer desktop Summit Ridge reveal that we've kind of been teased for almost like 4 years now, since the Zen architecture was first talked about and first started going into detail on. But now you can actually buy it. Actually, you could buy it a week ago or so, but now you should actually be receiving these if you pre-ordered it, and you can actually go out into stores and pick them up today. I'm going to be honest here. I'm recording this probably 4 or 5 days before the NDA, so there's going to be some things that we're leaving out of this due to time. We haven't had time to actually test it yet. That includes overclocking, really detailed temperature and thermal analysis, and going into a lot of those types of things. What we're going to talk about today is kind of what you get for your dollar, performance-wise, and we're only looking at, oops, as I move it across, the Ryzen 7 1800X. We're only looking at one of the three processors today in this video. If you go to the full review over at PCPro.com, which we will have linked in the description below, you will find a full host of benchmarks. You'll find probably some of the additional processors in there, the 1700X and the 1700. So make sure you go to PCPro.com and check that out. Consider this more of a summary portion, if you will, of that full story. Real quick, let's go over a couple of the details here. I'm sure many of you watching this already know it, but there are those 3 processors. The Ryzen is the brand. Ryzen 7 is the first iteration of in the highest end. 1800X, 1700X, and 1700. They will have prices of $499, $399, and $329, respectively. Only the third of that, which the 1700 actually ships with a heatsink in the box. The rest of them will require you to buy aftermarket coolers. All 3 of those processors are 8 cores, 16 threads. All 3 of those processors have 20 megs of total cache, L1, L2, L3, all that goodness. They're all built on 14 nanometer process technology from Global Foundries. And so they're very similar in a lot of ways. Obviously, they differ in their clock speeds. The top-end 1800X has a base clock of 3.6, max boost of 4.0 gigahertz. 1700X drops to 3.4 to 3.8 gigahertz, and then the 1700, 3.0 to 3.7, so a much wider range. It's also the only processor of the 3 that is a 65-watt TDP, so it's a little bit lower TDP. And my guess is a little bit higher for AMD to actually get to that TDP level with these parts. The 1800X and 1700X are 95-watt TDP parts, and we'll talk a little bit about why that's an interesting metric to look at. We're not going to go into the Zen architecture itself here. We've already gone through that many times if you listen to our podcast and other videos here.
The Ryzen hype train reached velocities capable of entering low Earth orbit as we ramped into today's launch. We had 4 days with all hands on deck to benchmark the AMD Ryzen R7 1800X that we're reviewing today, socketed in ASUS's high-end X370 Crosshair motherboard. Our Ryzen R7 1700 review will post tomorrow, with the 1700X review posting the day after that. Today, we're looking at the 1800X in Blender, Premiere, thermals, and gaming workloads. And before getting to Ryzen, this coverage is brought to you by Thermaltake's new Contact Silent 12 CPU cooler. The Contact Silent 12 fully supports the AM4 socket type and aims to be available around the $30 mark. Thermaltake's Contact 12 uses a hydraulic bearing for longer and quieter operation and would do well on an R7 1700. Learn more at the link in the description below. Speaking of links in the description, this review is massive. It's a new architecture, so check the link in the description below for the full review. It's nearing 10,000 words, has a bit more depth than we have here because of time constraints, so check the article for the full Ryzen architecture and benchmarks, but we can go into most of it here. The core specs are on the screen now. The R5 1600X and 1500X, interestingly, will offer sub $300 parts with 6 cores and 12 threads in Q2, with R3 parts due in the second half. Today we're looking only at the R7 1800X. For some brief details, major changes to the Ryzen architecture center around the CCX and its replacement of Bulldozer modules. Ryzen CCX moves to implementing a single FPU per core rather than 1 per 2 integer units on Bulldozer, and it also uses a single SIMD and private L2 cache per core. AMD has moved to wider instruction level parallelism, but still uses narrower floating point units, and AMD is running 512K of L2 cache per core at 1.5mm squared per core. This 512K cache is 8-way associative, so AMD doesn't need probes to interfere with low latency caches during snoops. The SRAM is less dense than Intel's, but is still 6T SRAM for tagging data with 8T for state. L3 cache totals 8 megabytes at 16mm squared of the total die area, which by the way is 44mm squared. L3 is also 16-way associative and shares PLL with all cores. The L3 cache can be shut down if only L1 and L2 are in use, which helps with automated power savings. Each CCX is a 4-core 8-thread module, meaning that we won't be seeing dual-core CPUs out of the currently known Zen architecture. AMD's L1 and L2 bandwidths are up about 2 times over previous architectures, with L3 up about 5-fold. The victim cache is shared across the CCX and operates at the frequency of the fastest core, which means that it also reduces frequency alongside the fastest core to further provide power savings. For each integer unit, there are 4 ALUs and 2 AGUs, or address generation units with a 2K op cache present. AMD's got a new micro op cache that is also something we'll be talking about in the article. AMD's queue has gotten significantly larger versus Bulldozer, though the company does still have major architectural differences from Intel. One example would be AMD's AVX units. The company is running two 128-bit wide units instead of the 256-bit wide units in Skylake, and is using two 256-bit load ports. This design takes less space overall, contributing to AMD's smaller area per core than comparable Intel chips, but does mean that we should expect different vector performance. AMD is also running one fewer AGU than its direct competition, which should help the company clock higher and will also lower power consumption. This is potentially at the cost of performance and workloads that can saturate 3 AGUs with 2 loads and a store per clock, but AMD thinks that it's worth the trade-off. As for an answer to Intel's Fiverr, AMD has one. They're sticking with linear voltage regulators to reduce complexity, heat, and retain conversion efficiency, and given how Intel's Fiverr was received, that might be a good choice. If you're curious about the AM4 chipset differences, we already have that content on the channel. Search for AM4 chipset differences or hit the link in the description below to the full review. Let's talk about memory for now. In the leaks leading up to Ryzen's launch, there were plenty of posts by users and other sites that talked about potential memory limitations on Ryzen. This was true to some extent, though maybe not as exaggerated as some folks may have made it. The official memory support for Ryzen right now is 2667 megahertz. That's what was largely suggested for benchmarking. We were able to clock up to 2933 megahertz on the kit provided and used that for our tests, and we're not able to sustain higher clock rates than 2933 for a few reasons. One of them, we have a Hynix Die Corsair kit. It officially is rated for 3000 megahertz, but to get any kind of higher frequency, you would need to do a few things. One, custom reference clock and VDIM tuning, and two, ideally step through memory training, and then three, note that there is a distinct lack of memory subtiming in Ryzen, and that's more of an AMD thing than a motherboard thing. So that's on Asus and more on AMD. This makes it a little difficult to get the higher clock rates that some of the kits might sell at, and at the time we were working on this review, which is of course prior to launch, the only officially validated kit of memory is the Corsair 3000 MHz Vengeance LPX kit that we had access to, which again we clocked to 2933 MHz. Enough of the theory though, time to get to the benchmarks. As always, the full testing methodology and all the platforms used is defined in the article in the description below. We have to obviously change motherboard, memory depending on architecture, stuff like that. It's all defined down there, and we're going to start with the Ryzen thermals versus clock over time, and then we'll be moving on to Adobe Premiere, Blender, and gaming workloads. This first chart shows two things primarily. We're looking at CPU junction temperature in blue and average frequency of the cores in red. Ideally, the red line is perfectly flat when under heavy load, indicating a more stable core clock. The blue line should never exceed 75C, as that is technically AMD's maximum junction temperature for the 1800X or TJ Max. We were able to intentionally trip a thermal shutdown by heating the CPU beyond 75C and validated that yes, TJ Max is in fact between 75 and 80 Celsius. Gauging thermal performance on AMD isn't exactly easy, and the diode reporting has some inconsistencies at times that manifest in the form of massive reported temperature drops. In reality, we're able to use thermal probes mounted to the package to gain some additional insight as to the accuracy of the measurements, and then we can make appropriate adjustments to our testing methodology. If we zoom into the chart, you'll see that the clock rate becomes less stable and starts to fluctuate in increments of 25 to 75 megahertz once temperature approaches 73 to 75 Celsius. This is AMD's internal sensors working with the clock to keep temperatures under control, downclocking in rapid intervals, and then upclocking again to keep thermals below 75C. And by the way, this is with an NZXT Kraken X62 at max fan speeds, so it's running pretty hot. This is an 1800X. Anyone putting this chip under 100% workloads for long uptimes like Blender rendering and things like that should seriously consider better cooling than the Noctua unit that AMD provided most reviewers, and that's why we switched, thanks to the AM3 support on the Crosshair, to an X62. Now, we also logged voltages versus applications, power draw, things like that for comparative power draw charts, link in the description below. But we can go over the basics now. With 185 watts total system power consumption, again that's total system power consumption, we see the Ryzen R7 1800X operating at a steady boost frequency of 3.7 gigahertz when all cores are engaged. This number only ever increases to XFR range of 4.1 if a single thread workload is underway. This is pretty uncommon for most of our audience, but we do have some tests to show it. The voltage to sustain Blender at this clock rate